Lonicera japonica, Japanese honeysuckle. Now, I'm not going to plant this. This is invasive and it should be rooted out whenever possible. So typically we find it along this fence next to things like poison ivy. With this little sample though, to identify this, the leaves as far as the shape goes isn't particularly unique, but if you just gently rub your thumb over it, you're going to feel that the surface is slightly coarse, so you don't have a smooth leaf there. And the stem is going to have a reddish color. Now, depending on how mature it is, sometimes those internodes can get quite long. Now, this is also the ones that you'll find growing out in the woods in the spring when you get the flowers. A lot of times people are familiar with these where you can pull the stamen out and then you get that kind of sweet nectar off of it. A lot of kids know what I'm talking about. But Japanese honeysuckle is not one we want to plant. Lonicera sempervirens. This is coral honeysuckle. This is the native honeysuckle. So we hear a lot about the Japanese honeysuckle, but this one's not invasive. So you can see this one coming off the corner and colonized this pretty well. This one's easy to identify, and you'll see why here in a second. Nice thing about this is take a look at those flowers right there. Hummingbirds come to this, so you get a lot of pollinators that are coming in. But one of the things that makes this easy to identify is the leaves right where it's getting ready to flower. So here you see those tube-like flowers, but take a look at the foliage that's right below it. You can see the two leaves are fused together. So you can see that one just below it. You're not going to see that on anything we cover. So I could tell you there's long internodes with kind of a reddish color, but those fused leaves right below, and even after the flowers have spent, you're still going to see them. So there you see right there with the flowers already gone. In fact, it's already setting some fruit. You can see those fused leaves right below it. Parthenocissus quinquefolia. So this is Virginia creeper. Now we don't see this used as an ornamental, at least not around here, and if it is, it's not very often. It tends to be just more of a weed in the landscape, at least around here in the low country. This is palmately compound, so you've got your 5 leaflets there. It's going to be different than any of the other palmately compound vines that we'll see. You do have some of a serration on the margins there. This one, sometimes you'll get 3 leaflets on it, and some people will confuse this for poison ivy, but those would just be on some of the juvenile leaves. If you look more closely, you're going to find the majority of them, in this case just about all of them, have 5 leaflets. This particular vine does a really good job of those rootlets that can come off of the stem there and grab on to just about any surface and creep up, in this case, a fence. Parthenocissus tricuspidata. So this is an interesting one. Does function well as a ground cover, but then it's going to crawl up objects. What makes this unique is tricuspidata tells you that the leaf, especially in its juvenile form, will have 3 leaflets, but then as this matures, the foliage then ends up with 1 leaf, and then you can see those 3 distinctive lobes right there. So sometimes when you get this on a wall, you just see the mature leaf right here, all arranged, and they're all pointing down. But in this particular case, the majority of what you see, at least in this bed, is a lot of the trifoliate growth habit of the foliage. So you will see both of them. This one does crawl up items fairly easily, and it does form those rootlets there that are going to grab onto any object. Rosa Banksia. This is Lady Banks rose. This is actually the cultivar Lutea, yellow flowering, but it's a rose. It's got little miniature, these little miniature yellow roses on it. That's not uncommon for it. You see those long stems that are coming off, so it can get a little bit wild wherever it's at, but the flowering is exceptional. Now we got a bunch of vines growing on here, so some of these other things you see, We're going to focus in on identifying this thing. This is going to have 3 or 5 leaflets. Just depends on the age of the leaf that you're looking at. So let's take a look at this one. So if you know the number of the leaflets, that should separate it from anything else. But the other thing is it's got a very fine serration. You can just see the tips of that serration going along. So it's very fine, almost like a hacksaw versus some of the other things we've seen. You can see that's got 3 leaflets. There's a couple of others in there that's got 5 leaflets attached. The color of the stem, when it's young, it's green. But as that matures, you start to see that losing that color to some extent, but it does hang on to a lighter green for a period of time. Smilax smallii, or greenbrier. This is typically a weed here in the low country. I don't know of any place that really grows it ornamentally. And it's tenacious because it's got this giant tuber in the ground, so you can cut it back and it'll just keep coming back. Identifying it, simple leaf. And take a look at the venation. You can see how it's just parallel as it's coming up the leaf there. Alternate arrangement, but a couple of other things here that are good keys. Look at that green stem. So it tends to maintain that color on the stem. And most importantly, when this thing's a weed, it becomes really difficult because it ends up with all of these thorns along the stem here. This one's not too bad because it's fairly small, but once this thing gets large, as you're trying to pull it out, these are just jamming into your hand here. Trochilospermum asiaticum. This is Asiatic jasmine. Now this serves primarily as a ground cover. It gets really dense, but once it gets trapped, starts getting confined in an area, it will start creeping up walls and fences. In fact, we just recently had to clean this thing back. It had crept into this back area here. It doesn't have the flowers and the fragrance like you get with Confederate jasmine, but the identifications are going to be pretty similar. This has a smaller leaf than Confederate jasmine. If you rub your finger and thumb over it, you're going to find it's got a glossy leaf surface. And take a look at that venation, the way it's just kind of distinctly doesn't reach the margin there. It almost looks like it turns around and goes back, but you can see it even better on the back side. This is unique. It's just got that much lighter green color with those distinctive green veins that are a little bit darker. Now what you also see with Asiatic jasmine is this variegated variety. Now this is a pretty good sample. It's got the smaller leaves that are about half the size or less than the Confederate jasmine. The standard Asiatic jasmine is all green, so this one being variegated doesn't photosynthesize quite as much. It tends to be a little less aggressive. You don't see it as much. For the quiz, we might be using the variegated, which would make it really easy for us to identify. You might also see the other one if I can find a good sample. We're just looking at a smaller leaf size. Trochilospermum jasminoides. This is Confederate jasmine, not a great sample. It's the only one we've got. You can see what it looks like when it's growing in mostly shade. It'll hang in there, but it's very sparse until it's just looking for sunlight, and then it'll explode. If this was in full sun, this would be extremely dense. Of course, this serves as a vine. It's just not going to do the ground cover much at all. It's looking for something to climb on. It is a winder, so it doesn't have any root-like appendages that will grab on. We're going to identify this in the same way we did the Asiatic jasmine, but look at the leaf. It's a little bit bigger, but it has a similar characteristic in terms of color. The venation is somewhat similar. And of course, if you flip it over, it looks very much like the Asiatic jasmine. So how do you tell the difference between these two? It's primarily going to be leaf size and where it's growing at. Vitis rotundifolia, muscadine grape. And this is the one that's going to produce edible grapes. As far as identifying it, it is a simple leaf, and the margins be something that's more referred to as dentate, similar to a serration, but you don't have that kind of sawtooth shape, quite as much as you see in other things that are referred to as serrates. The stem can get pretty woody. We'll see these things developing out in the woods where it gets some pretty big trunks going. The interesting thing you're going to see in our sample is you see those notches taken out, and what you get there is a leaf cutting bee. It's actually coming in, chewing off bits of it and taking it back to lay its eggs. And in this guy, every once in a while, it just depends on the year, we'll get some fruit developing on this. We've got some showing up around here, but this guy does need supports. In fact, you can see it once it gets happy, it starts climbing up other things as well. Wisteria frutescens, American wisteria. Now the sample that we've got is not frutescens. This is most likely Wisteria floribunda or Wisteria sinensis. This is the invasive one, but for identification purposes, this will do just fine. We pulled this out of the trees. The way you're going to identify wisteria is it's going to be similar to Campsis radicans, which was the trumpet creeper. They are both pinnately compound. You can see this is odd pinnately compound. It's got the leaflet at the very end. The difference between those two vines is the margin on wisteria is entire or smooth, whereas with the Campsis radicans, it's going to be serrate. So in a juvenile stage, it could look pretty similar. And of course, wisteria gets to a point where that vine gets almost like a tree branch where it can start winding around other things. And if you get into some mature areas, you'll actually see wisteria is a legume. So once it's flowered and it's setting fruit, you're gonna see those bean pods. X-Facetera lizii. This is tree ivy. Now this is a cross between two genera or two genuses. One of them being Fatsia, the other one being Hetera. Hetera is going to be the genus of our ivies, like English ivy and Algerian ivy. So this is a cross or a hybrid, and you can actually see it does have some characteristics in terms of lobing to the English ivies, and we haven't covered Fatsia yet, but the leaf is similar to that. It's like a smaller version of it. So it's a very unique leaf shape that you're going to be able to identify. The thing with this is it's not really a vine and it's not really a shrub. It's just kind of like this woody vine. It doesn't twine, it doesn't grab, it needs lots of support. It just keeps getting longer and longer. But it does provide a really interesting texture and a unique form. Militia reticulata. This is the evergreen wisteria. Now this looks a lot like wisteria, but it's not even in the wisteria genus. But it's a great substitute for something like that because you do get these winding vines that get extremely woody. This has been here for 15 years or so. Even though it's colonized a good bit of this, that's quite a bit of time. It really hasn't taken over everything. The leaves do look a lot like wisteria. You can get 9 leaflets, but it does vary in number depending on maturity. If you look at wisteria right here, you can see wisteria is a little bit more pointed. We get a little bit more of a rounded apex to the evergreen wisteria, but it's still fairly similar. Now this time of the year is fairly easy to identify this because it's blooming. We don't get blooms on wisteria this in August. We get them early spring, and in this case we get kind of these spiky blooms that just seem to open up these really appealing dark purple petals. So and it just starts to bloom in sequence. So you can see we still have quite a few flower buds kind of growing out towards the terminal end of that. Absolutely love this vine. I wish we would see it more often. It's very useful, just lacks those invasive qualities that we see with wisteria, and we can get a lot of nice ornamental appeal out of that winding vine there. You will have to give it some support until it gets up over some structure.